Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. A year or two ago, I promised that I would reread Edith Wharton's short novel, Ethan Frome, a book I hadn't read in what is now nearly 40 years, on the very next snow day in the Washington, D.C. area. Although we usually have at least a couple of snowstorms each year, with a couple of inches each time, and sometimes have major storms with a foot or more of snow, we got nothing for quite a while after I made my reading promise. In my first video of the year, after seeing a great discussion on Shelley Swearengen's channel, I reiterated my commitment to read Ethan Frome, if it were ever to snow again. And sure enough, within a couple of weeks, we had 5 inches or so in my neighborhood. As the snow started coming down, I lit a fire in the fireplace, one of those fake logs that are super easy to light, but not nearly as satisfying as real logs, and sat down with my paperback Penguin Classics Deluxe edition of the Edith Wharton novel. It's an interesting and somewhat ambiguous cover, and the French flaps essentially have comic strip panels referring to key symbolic moments, things that don't give anything away for those of you who might be concerned about spoilers, but which will resonate in new ways after you read the book and see them in their literary contexts. I've told the story before of reading and hating this book 40 years ago, but let me tell it again so you'll understand my trepidation about this particular reread. I was 17 years old, and it was the night before a big college scholarship interview. My mother's collection of classic novels lived on the top shelves of the built-in bookcases along one wall of my childhood bedroom. And as I got older and taller, I used to pull various volumes down whenever I needed something to read. That night, I thought a slim book would be perfect to keep me calm and distracted. I pulled down Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome, an old Norton Critical edition as I remember it, perhaps the first Norton Critical I had picked up. I started reading and absolutely hated it. Hated the characters and their closed-off, weak meanness to each other. Well, the next day I sat in the scholarship interview with 5 or 6 interviewers facing me and asking me all sorts of questions. One of the first, what's the best book you've read recently? Now, this should have been an easy question for me, but I immediately launched into a rant about how I had just read the worst book I'd ever read the night before and why I hated it. When I finally finished my diatribe, I felt like an idiot and stumbled around trying to emerge from the world of the book I had just spent 20 minutes reliving and shift to some book I loved. Why didn't I just talk about Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice or maybe Antigone? Well, now, of course, I realize that the rant about how much I hated a particular classic book and why actually showed I was a fairly serious reader, and it showed at least as much as saying I had loved a book. I got the scholarship. Still, my hatred of Ethan Frome was so visceral that it took me almost 3 decades to read any other Edith Wharton books. When I finally did, I absolutely loved Age of Innocence and Custom of the Country, and especially The House of Mirth. But I still hadn't tried Ethan Frome again. I just couldn't bring myself to do it when there are so many amazing books still to be read surrounding it on my shelves. But many of you here on Booktube have been talking about why it's such a powerful book, and I realize that my teenage reading prejudices are not necessarily reasonable anymore, and a snowy day seemed like the right time to have another go. For those of you who don't know, the book is set in a cold and snowy setting, and that weather is pretty essential to most of the plot and to the frigid personalities of some of the characters. Just a side note, Wharton published what is sometimes thought of as a companion book called Summer, where warm, sunny weather seems to inspire much more sexual passion. Wharton herself nicknamed this second book Hot Ethan, and I will definitely be reading that sometime this summer. But let's get back to Ethan Frome and its snowy setting. The basic plot traces the lives of Ethan Frome, a man who is 28 when the chronology of the story first starts, and who lives with his slightly older wife in a rural part of New England. For those of you who don't know, New England, in the northeast corner of the United States, was initially settled by Puritans, adherents to a religion rooted partly in a belief in predestination, which, to oversimplify, is the idea that God chose which people to save before the world was even created. Not because the people contributed in any way to their chance of salvation through doing good deeds or whatever. In fact, you could say that people didn't receive religious salvation because they did good deeds, but instead did good deeds because they were among the elect, whom God had already chosen to save. Ethan Frome is not at all a religious book, but I'm bringing up this religious tradition because Edith Wharton is basically using a secular version of predestination as she writes. Literary critics would probably call it determinism, and it's part of the tradition of literary realism that was popular when Wharton was writing early in the 20th century. Just as predestination suggested that people had no control over whether they received salvation, determinism suggests that larger forces, rather than personal choices, determine what will happen to individuals. Here in the novel Ethan Frome, the most obvious linguistic force is the weather, the frigid, snowy world that sometimes seems to be determining almost everything, both the events that happen and the personalities that people have. Another deterministic force is poverty. So Ethan and his wife Zena are joined by her cousin Maddie, several years younger than Ethan, who moves in with them partly to be an aide to Zena, who is ill. Although neither Ethan nor Maddie acknowledges it to the other at first, the two start to fall in love with each other. Although Zena seems to be aware of their attraction, she too refrains from talking about it straightforwardly. It's implied here that Zena tries to get control of the situation by exaggerating the struggles with her health. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but basically she finds a way to require that Maddie move out of the house. Ethan insists that he wants to accompany her to the train station, and we know it's because he wants to have a few more minutes together with Maddie before they have to say goodbye to each other. At this point in the novel, we're fairly close to the end. Often I read books where it isn't clear to me that knowing about what happens at the end would make any difference at all to a reader's perception, but that isn't the case in this book. The story ends with developments you might want to discover for yourself. And so before I talk about the end of the book, which I'll do late in the video, I'll give you a clear warning. Honestly, I was a bit surprised when I was reading that the issue of spoilers came up in this book. The very first chapter gives us a picture of what is going to happen at the end. The unnamed narrator meets Ethan Frome and realizes that he walks with a significant limp. The narrator hears from other community members that the limp is a result of what the book calls a smash-up, an accident that happened more than 2 decades before. It's clear from the earliest pages that we're going to hear about what made Ethan limp, but as it turns out, we don't find out until the last 12 pages or so. Nevertheless, what we learn opens the book up in new ways. Let me go back. I guess the question I haven't answered yet is, did I enjoy this book this time around? And the answer is definitely yes, although I don't think it is in any way as strong as The House of Mirth or Wharton's other full-length novels that I've read. It's fascinating to reread a book I had such intense feelings about, a book that's been my go-to, most hated book for so long, and think about why I disliked it so much then, and why I've changed my mind, at least mostly. I think what bothered me most at the time was the coldness of the characters and their lack of connection to each other. Their specific story, but also how Wharton chooses to portray their specific story. We have a man who isn't in love with his wife, but stays with her anyway. A cantankerous wife, and a naive young woman who lives with them and seems poised to break up their marriage. My distaste for the book wasn't just the bleakness. Zena, in particular, is drawn in a completely unsympathetic way as a whiny and passive-aggressive hypochondriac. She's even described as gaunt and wrinkled, even though she's only in her early 30s. Wharton suggests that she seeks expensive medications for illnesses that are supposedly illegitimate just so she can control the family finances and make it impossible for her husband to get ahead. We can't really tell if chronic illness made her cruel or if her pre-existing cruelty made her fake illness in order to manipulate her husband. But, well, both ideas irritated me back then. At 17 years old, when I was both a burgeoning feminist and also a bit of a prude, I was actually more than just irritated. First of all, why wasn't Ethan blamed for being dishonest to Zena? In Jimmy Carter's words, which he'd said not that long before I read the book, Ethan had been sinning in his heart and not being willing to acknowledge it, meaning he was dishonest, that is, lying to his wife over and over. Why did Wharton portray him as a sympathetic character whose will was being thwarted by his evil and controlling wife, including his will to have an affair with his wife's cousin? She writes as if he could be happy with Maddie if only Zena wouldn't be so cruel and villainous. Again and again, Ethan would be happy and in love if Zena were not such a jerk. That just isn't reasonable. Even if Zena was manipulative, it was at least partly because she was being mistreated. Still, I found her annoying because I wanted her just to speak up and call Ethan on his behavior instead of the passive-aggressive stuff. And how do we know Zena isn't actually ill? There are certainly implications, but nothing convincing. We do know she wasn't dying. The first few pages of the novel make it clear that she is still alive more than 20 years later and still ordering expensive medications. But this is a novel. Zena and these misogynist portrayals of her motivations were completely constructed by the author. This isn't an historian trying to make sense of a real-life person in a real-life situation. Although, even if it were, couldn't we just as reasonably say that she wanted to be cared for so much that she turned to medical care when marital love was withheld from her? And also, to be blunt, I don't think villains make much sense in literary fiction, where I usually expect at least a bit of subtlety. There was another book I read at the same time that I disliked for similar reasons. I wasn't much of a fan of the novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and there's something similar about Zena and Mrs. Danvers. Over time, I've come to really appreciate the campiness of Mrs. Danvers, and also to be disappointed in the unnamed new wife, who has none of the spunk and strength of Jane Eyre, to whom she's usually compared. So, did I change my mind about this book on this reread? Well, yes, in some ways, I very much enjoyed Wharton's control of language and imagery. I newly appreciated some of the very direct symbolism and motifs that when I was young I thought were too obvious. More on that in a minute. I also think I appreciate some of the irony that we see develop, which I'll talk about more at the end of the video. But some of my reactions as a youth have not actually changed that much. I'm still aggravated by how little compassion Wharton seems to have for her flawed female characters as compared to her flawed male characters. I'm irked by the trivializing of illness and the implication that a disabled body makes for a twisted mind. And this time, I was also annoyed with what I often felt was a rejection of the humanity of people living in poverty. Of course, I think most people see this exactly the opposite way, that Wharton was trying to show how a lack of needed resources could harm the poor so intensely. I understand that argument, and I really appreciate that Wharton tried to write about people who weren't in her very elite circles, where honestly people didn't always act in humane ways there either. Still, there doesn't seem to be the kind of compassion in this book that I would expect if Wharton's goal was to highlight the detrimental effects of poverty. Similarly, many readers see the book Ethan Frome as overtly feminist, showing how sexism and isolation cripples women. I just don't buy that argument. Ethan Frome is equally crippled here, both before the accident and then literally after the accident. But if this feminist view is how you interpret the book, I would love to hear your justification for this interpretation, either down in the comments or in your own video if you want to play along. Still, I now see this book's portrayal of both gender and disability as much more complicated in a lot of different ways. We're not hearing the story from an omniscient narrator, first of all, and the misogynistic views of women, especially poor women, aren't in Wharton's voice, but initially in the anonymous narrator's voice, and then effectively in limited perspective third-person narration, which seems to be based on how Ethan Frome himself saw the story, or possibly how other people pieced that story together from bits and pieces they found out only through Ethan. I think it's an open question whether Wharton intended for us to question that voice in the ways I'm questioning it, but I suspect she chose to write using this somewhat complicated narrative form for a reason. So at this point, I want to enter spoiler territory that you might want to avoid if you haven't read the book. Go off, read! Still here? Well, here's the quick summary of the last 12 pages. The first level spoiler happens when Ethan is taking Maddie to the train. They stop and go sledding together, which they'd wanted to do beforehand but hadn't. Their first run down the snow-covered hill is beautiful. They express their love for each other, and Ethan steers them adroitly away from a tree in the treacherous path. Then it becomes clear that neither one wants to part from the other. Maddie, with her bright red scarf still whipping around her neck, with just as much meaning as Hester's scarlet letter, suggests that they should sled down again, but that this time Ethan shouldn't steer away from the tree, but instead slam them into it directly. By this means, they wouldn't have to part from each other. In fact, they would be able to spend all their remaining time together. Ethan sits in front of Maddie with her arms around him, and they slide down the track. And then we come to a line I've used metaphorically and sarcastically ever since I first read the book to refer to any unavoidable crisis in front of us. Quote, "And then the elm." But they don't die, as they had planned. And after the crash, Ethan cries out, and then Maddie does as well. The next scene is the level 2 spoiler. We readers go back to that initial Frame story with the unknown narrator unexpectedly staying at the Frome's house during an intense snowstorm, 20 plus years after the sledding accident. And who is living there but Ethan, with his bum leg and a bright red scar across his face, his scarlet letter, and Maddie, who is now not only fully paralyzed, but equally as cantankerous as Xena had been in the earlier sections. And Xena herself, who takes care of all of them, despite her own continuing search for remedies for health issues. Ethan and Maddie are getting what they wanted, to spend the rest of their lives together, although certainly not in the way they intended. The themes of both disability and gender roles just explode in these last few pages, but not with any clear sense of resolution. I've been wondering about some of the other reasons why I no longer dislike, much less hate, this book anymore. And I think part of the reason is strangely related to a discussion I had about Jeanette Winterson's The Passion in my last video. The Passion was the very first piece of contemporary literary fiction I'd read, and it blew my socks off, partly, I think, because I had not read anything even remotely like it before. In the case of Ethan Frome, I think I was thrown off that this book is shaped fairly dramatically by the fact that it is not truly a novel, but a novella. And novellas have a very different feel to them, one that's often a bit more symbolic or metaphoric, or, ironically, big. Novellas often have that really big action or idea wrapped in a very light coating of plot development and character. In other words, novellas sometimes give us a lot to think about directly and immediately, instead of the way a long novel might slowly and more gently lead us into an understanding of more complex characters and their lives. Does that make any sense? Now, I'm a lot more comfortable with the ways novels and novellas differ, and I recognize what novellas can do especially well. One of those things is to give us a quick emotional punch, something Ethan Frome as a novel does, and which has struck with me so intensely since, the autumn of 1984, I think, when I first read this book. The fact that I remembered so much of the plot, and even much of the imagery and language from reading it 40 years ago, makes me understand more about why this book has retained such an important place in American literature. Well, I am thrilled that I finally reread Ethan Frome this week. Because I was so absorbed in thinking about the differences between my first read of it and my so long afterwards second read, I think I might need to read it yet again. Thanks to all of you for listening to me babble about this today, as well as to those of you who encouraged me to give it another shot, either by direct recommendation or just by talking about your own love of the book. See you again soon here on Hannah's Books.